Hello and welcome to another edition of Dr. K's Psychobabble. And today's topic is actually in response to a question that I received in one of my current classes going on here in the summer of 2020. Essentially, a student in my psychology class asked, "What's a variable?" And having used that word for so many years, and having understood it in so many different contexts, that I never really kind of thought about bringing it right down to that particular question. I usually talk about variables in the context of talking about research methods. First talking about research methods and then talking about variables. But I thought today what I would do is take a stab at this. Let's look at variables and then move our way toward the methods that psychology uses to study them. So with the help of some graphics here we have variables are things that change. That's why we call them variables. I mean, they vary. So this can be anything. The world of science, the world of speculation, when we're sitting around the table, and that's kind of an example I'll use here throughout today's presentation, we think about why things happen and the individual pieces that we bring together in our explanation, the concepts, the causes, the things that are happening at the same time, the reasons, let's say, those can, for all intents and purposes, be called variables. If we're trying to figure out something, let's say we're sitting around the table and friends of ours, Stan and Sue, have broken up. They were together for years and now they've broken up, and we're all sitting around, we didn't see this coming, and we're speculating what's going on, what caused them to break up. And we can start talking about various things that we've heard of about these two individuals. We can speculate about why our relationships didn't work, and maybe that's why their relationships didn't work. But the things that come up, we might say, for example, well, Stan was cheating on her. And we would say, well, that would be a reason why Sue might leave Stan, and therefore the fidelity of the relationship, whether they're cheating or not, is a variable that we can study to see the relationship between that particular potential cause of a breakup and real breakups in the world. So every one of those factors, they lost a job, they never got along, they argue too much, they have money problems, the kids are getting unruly, she got a job in another town, her parents are interfering, he doesn't take the trash out, whatever it is, whatever the situation is, each one of those things is a variable in the question that we as psychologists would have as to what are the things that break up marriages. And of course, conversely, we would look at the things, the variables involved in what keeps a relationship going. So psychologists are very keen about understanding how variables change. All of science is, but psychology is really interested in understanding how human behavior changes. And then we can go back to the original aspect of this class where we talked about the 4 goals, where we describe, explain, predict, and control human and animal behavior. We look at those 4 goals have to describe. We list the variables that are involved in understanding this. We explain the relationship between those variables, and we'll get to that in just a bit. We predict because we understand those relationships now, and ultimately we can either bring about change or we can prevent change from happening by manipulating those variables. So, as psychology is interested in understanding how variables change, we look that variables within the field of psychology, each one of these things are in relationships with each other. So, almost all of psychology is about these relationships, not just interpersonal relationships, but the relationships between variables. So here we have a couple of variables, variable 1, variable 2, and I'm going to keep things pretty abstract for right now. Variable 1 and variable 2. Two things that we are studying as psychologists, and we want to see what's the relationship between these two things. So here we have our two variables, and for the time being, we're going to focus on variables that are measurable with numerical data. And this puts us neatly into the quantitative research methods area, as opposed to qualitative research, which is really worthy of its own video separately. So we're really looking at quantitative variables here, things that we can measure. So one of the relationships that we can understand about variables is that when we measure variable 1 and we compare it to variable 2, we might find that as one changes, the other one changes in predictable ways. For instance, when variable 1 goes down, variable 2 goes down as well. And conversely, when variable 1 goes up, variable 2 goes up. Now that type of relationship is called a positive correlation, meaning the value of these two variables as they're measured go up and down together. So for example, let's say we were looking at learning and we want to know the relationship between studying and final grades in a class. And we might see that individuals who rack up a whole bunch of studying hours and therefore have high levels of studying may also have high grades. Those would go up and down together. They would be positively correlated with each other. As your studying goes down, your grades might go down. Now, of course, there are what we call outliers. There are people that don't have to study and they get straight A's anyway. And then you have people that can study their brains out, putting all kinds of time in, and either because of a lack of capacity or because they're not studying in the right way, they still can't be successful in their grades. But for the most part, we see that increasing studying hours increases grades. Those are two variables, grades and studying hours. Those are two examples of variables, how they can go up and down. Now, there could be something else. Let's say we were going to measure the amount of television that somebody watches, or the amount of video games that somebody plays, the hours per week, let's say, that they play video games or watch television. How does that affect grades? And we might see a relationship more like this. As TV time goes down, grades go up. Now, this is what we call a negative correlation, meaning regardless of what the variables are, as one increases, the other one decreases. So, the methodology that we use, and I mentioned it in the actual description of these relationships, is correlation research, where we gather data on two measurable variables, and sometimes even more. We can have what's called a bivariate two variables. See where the word variable is. So bivariate two variable correlation, and we're just looking to see the degree to which they move together in response to each other. We can have multivariate correlations. We can have regressions. We can have all kinds of statistical tools that allow us to understand how variables move together. Now, it's very important, even when we're just sitting here talking about variables, to understand that correlations, things that go up and down together, are not necessarily in a causal relationship. They're moving up and down together, but they don't cause one another. So let's say, for example, on sunny days, more people drown. Fairly well-known statistic that on sunny days, more people drown. So people shouldn't be in the water, right, on sunny days. But that's really not a cause-effect relationship. The sun being out doesn't cause drowning. The sun being out causes more people to go to the beach. And when there's more people at the beach, there's just statistically, there's more likelihood that someone will drown. So we can see that increased sun time increases, that we also see an increase in drownings, but they just go together. There's an intermediary factor called more people go to the beach. That's another variable. That's another factor that comes in for us to understand the complete picture of something that we observe in the real world. Now there's another relationship, the one that correlation isn't, and that is a causal relationship. And that is in the presence of a variable, another variable will change because of that particular variable's presence. So let's say here's our variables again, and when we put these together, they produce a third measure. So let's say we're going to talk about learning again. And let's say we were going to talk about tutoring. So we may, for example, we want to decide whether or not tutoring is an effective way for people to obtain good grades. Now, we may initiate a correlation study to see that indeed people with tutoring and people without tutoring, just looking at the data, people with tutoring tended to do better. But if we're going to really look as to whether or not tutoring is the factor that's going on, we have to design an experiment. Now, an experiment is when we as scientists look at those variables and we purposefully control and manipulate them. That's different than in a correlation where we're simply making observations. In an experiment, we are specifically targeting variables and assuring that we can understand through methodologies in experimental psych to isolate the effect of that particular variable. So in our sequence here, we may have an experiment where we would have two groups. We'd take everybody that's taking college algebra, and we would randomly assign them to two groups. So there's bright people and not so bright people in both groups. There's people of different ages in both groups, the different genders, all the different things. The two groups are very similar to one another. This is a very important part of determining whether or not tutoring is going to be the actual factor. Now then what we do is we take one group and we give them regular instruction without tutoring, and then we take that second group and we give them regular instruction and tutoring, and then we measure the difference between the groups. And any difference that we see between the groups, if we design our study well, can be attributed to the one thing that's different between them. One got another variable. There was another variable involved in the other one, and that was getting tutoring. Now, statistics. The statistics that we use in correlations and the statistics that we use in experiments are the tools that we use to determine how strong these relationships are, how reliable our data was, and what's the likelihood that we just got something by chance. And so statistics plays a huge role in us making decisions as to the relationship between variables. Low statistics, very low-powered statistics, mean the relationship isn't really strong, and there's cutoff points in the world, in the science of psychology, where we're going to say, yeah, there might be a relationship between these variables, but it's so weak, it doesn't really meet the criteria of science. So we're going to have to reject the idea that there's a relationship here. It's very likely, for instance, that we just got a funny group of people and they ended up with this relationship between each other. Okay, so that is what we talk about in the field of psychology, is variables. So when we approach a question or a topic, let's say in our research projects, or when we're thinking about psychology and we think, why does somebody do something? Why does somebody quit school? Why does somebody get into doing drugs? Why does somebody succeed in athletics while others don't? What we're really, preliminarily, when we're doing our reading and research on things, what we are looking for are the variables. What are the variables and factors that have been connected in the research to these kinds of results? So let's just say, for example, that we're looking at drug abuse and we find out that poverty is correlated with drug use. Now, that doesn't mean that poverty causes it, but poverty is one of the factors that contributes to the likelihood of somebody getting involved in drugs. Now, in athletics, we could say the availability of excellent coaching would obviously be a variable for that individual to be able to excel. And so when we're looking at topics and we're trying to dissect them and understand how they work or how certain things manifest, what we're looking for are the variables. We find these variables when we look at existing research on those topics. People who in the past have been interested in understanding the variables that make up this phenomenon that we're looking at, be it drug use or excellent athletics or being good or bad at school. And they looked at the different causal factors or correlation factors. They looked at all these variables and they've examined and they've published works on them in what we call peer-reviewed literature. So we have these sort of generic questions, what brings about autism, for example, and then we go to the research and we say, what are the variables that bring about autism? And we start looking at the research that's out there that actually answers those questions to the best of our knowledge right now. Now, those sources are infinitely better than what we get online or through social media or YouTube or anything like that, because of the peer-reviewed nature and the discipline that goes into using appropriate correlation and experimental methods to study these variables. They're just not winging this off their head. They're using a specified methodology that we call, as you well know, the scientific method. So I hope that this has been useful in explaining the term variable, and then you can see how variables are the target, they're the focus of the different research methods that we have in order to discover how they relate to each other and what variables are involved in bringing about certain kinds of phenomena that we see in everyday life. So have a great day. Remember to subscribe to this channel and click the little bell or something. I'm not quite sure how that works, so you get notified of new videos that come out, and I will see you next time.